Hi, let's talk a little bit about risk more specifically. I've talked a lot about the finance systems. Let's talk a bit more about the risk systems specifically. Finance as a modern domain, as a modern process, began over 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago. Risk is much more new, much younger in its domain science. My belief is that many of the risk people that began doing these things in the corporate world, they knew about the finance systems. They were aware of the quality of the data and would have liked to have used the finance data. But as soon as they began looking at it and trying to use it, they found that it was completely inadequate for producing any reasonable risk analysis. Problem is, there are probably two problems. One problem, though that's a major one, is the level of detail. The level of detail in the finance system is just simply too highly aggregated to be useful from a risk perspective. You have to understand customers and products and have those kinds of attributes. A second problem in the risk data area is that it needed broader sets of business events than were captured in the financial system. Risk tends to be a forward projecting process, something that tells us where we could end up. To do that, you want to take in a broad swath of data, not just that narrow set of financial transactions that accounting defined by the accounting standards. You want that broader set. So those two factors caused risk, as it developed as a domain, to establish their own data supply chain. That data supply chain gathered business events, or in some cases, they didn't gather business events and establish posting processes. They just pulled the balances from the source systems as they existed. That process means that risk never had or hasn't had the same sort of dependence upon posting that they were aware of. Posting happened in other people's systems. They're completely dependent upon it. They just don't know it. So that process of a second data supply chain between risk and finance has developed such that, in a certain sense, even though these two things are tied in a way, that perhaps risk tries to forecast where things might end up, and then finance rolls forward such that they end up at a particular point in time, you should be able to perhaps compare the two. And in fact, that comparison between risk and finance does happen. In banking, for example, highly regulated industry, regulators compare risk and finance very directly. They want to know, what is your risk models and where did they tell you were going to be at, and how are you going to be able to respond to the risks out there. And finance as well has to present very detailed analysis of what the financial situation of the company is. When those two things don't reconcile, which in most cases they never do because they're two different data supply chains, it undermines the credibility of both of them. The auditor discussion, the regulator discussion, begins with the question of which of these two systems is right for this particular point in time. Why don't they reconcile? And which one is wrong? That's not a very good position to be in because it undermines the credibility of both the finance and the risk data. So if we were to get to a consolidated data supply chain, it would require a couple things. One, we have to recognize that not all the data is going to be shared between risk and finance. They're going to be independent in some respects because there's attributes and things needed for risk that aren't needed for finance. Risk doesn't care at all about expense management. Finance cares very much about that. So the Venn diagram is an overlapping diagram of some level of attributes needed and some level of business events needed between the two that are shared in common, but not everything. Then we also would have to lower the level of detail needed in order to enable risk processing, risk analysis. We'd have to understand customers. We'd have to understand contracts. We'd have to know many more things than our finance system tells us today. But if we got to that, then it's not so much that the finance system does all of the risk modeling involved. We don't have to quite go that far. The finance system is much shorter. The finance data supply chain is much shorter than the risk data supply chain. The finance system, though, the data in the finance system, in our consolidated data supply chain, should be able to enable the risk modeling processes that go on. Doing so will consolidate the cost associated with maintaining data supply chains, which are very fixed, very significant cost, reduce the number of adjustments, increase the credibility, increase the value of the data, because now not only do we understand customer transactions and balances, we understand what their potential balances are and what their potential transactions are. Doing so increases the value both to finance and to risk and to the organization overall. That's why we should be striving towards a consolidated data supply chain.